When it comes to reviewing horror movies on this channel, I'm pretty much always looking out to try and find the next Black Mountainside, the next Splinter, the next Isolation. These movies that I love to refer to and to talk about and to watch and to think about and recommend to friends because they are such hidden gems. They really are brilliant movies in the horror genre. They're not just films which I happen to like, but they're films which, objectively speaking, I strongly believe I can recommend to other people. In some cases, even people who aren't necessarily horror fans. I would not say you need to be a horror nut or an aficionado to enjoy Black Mountainside. Even somebody who prefers thrillers or mysteries, they could still really enjoy it. And the reason why I bring up Black Mountainside specifically is because this particular film, The Corridor, 2010 Canadian film, actually reminds me of Black Mountainside quite a bit. It has a lot of very similar themes. It actually came out before that movie, so technically Black Mountainside is kind of like this one. And interestingly, this movie also reminds me of a much more controversial and far better known film than Black Mountainside, which is Dreamcatcher. Now, Dreamcatcher, of course, is based on Stephen King's work. I have not read Stephen King's Dreamcatcher, but I have seen the movie, and I think that the first half of that film is quite enjoyable. The blood-soaked bathroom, the parasite, all that kind of stuff. The second half, though, with the Morgan Freeman stuff and the more army-based weirdness, it kind of falls apart. But the film definitely has a lot of promise, and I actually do like some of what they did there. This movie, I would say, takes on that aspect of Dreamcatcher, the great chemistry of the characters, the good casting, and also the interplay between them to create real tension because you generally care about these people. You genuinely even care about them. That is what I would say The Corridor does well also, because the story of this movie, because chances are you probably haven't heard of it that much, if at all, are that there's a group of friends, and one of them has mental issues, let's say, and that becomes very apparent right from the start of the film. Then these friends, later on, and as far as I could tell, an indeterminate amount of time, but a reasonable one, at least a number of months, if not maybe a year or so, possibly more, they decide to go on a trip together. Now, I said it was a Canadian film. Just like Black Mountainside, it is set in a very claustrophobic, snowy area. Once again, like my favourite movie ever, The Thing. It's a great way to pay homage to that kind of movie, even unintentionally. And they go out on this trip to a cabin where they used to spend their childhood occasionally, and to kind of relive these memories, and in some cases bring up things which many of them probably wouldn't like to remember, how they kind of bully each other, in effect, even though kids don't tend to see it that way sometimes. Now, as far as how it progresses from there, the character, the one of these friends who initially in the film has kind of a breakdown mentally, he discovers something very strange when they're at this cabin. And it's kind of hard to explain without seeing it and without spoiling it, so I won't really get into that, but he finds a very strange phenomena when he's out walking alone in the snow. And he tries to get all the others to go and check it out as well to make sure that he's not going crazy. And they do go and check it out, and basically the film progresses from there in a similar way to Dreamcatcher, for sure, but much more so Black Mountainside, and a couple of other films where it's more so about the paranoia of the situation than it is about a monster design or gory effects. For instance, John Carpenter's The Thing does very well because it does both. It has the paranoia and it has a great monster. This movie doesn't really lean into the monster side of things, it's not that kind of movie, and to some degree even Black Mountainside has elements of a monster movie. But just like Black Mountainside, this movie, The Corridor, tends to not go fully into that side of things and sticks more to the psychological stuff. And I would say it's actually all the better for it. It works really well for this movie because despite feeling so similar to movies like Dreamcatcher and Black Mountainside, it certainly doesn't feel like it's aping them. And of course, it couldn't feel like it's aping Black Mountainside anyway, and vice versa, that movie does not feel like it's copying this one, despite the fact that they have so much in common. Now, as far as my actual scores go, first of all for the story and the plot, I wasn't sure exactly what I wanted to give it. Because, yes, the story is, I would say, well told. It doesn't necessarily have things which kill it at a certain point. Sometimes movies like this won't necessarily end that strongly. For me, Yellow Brick Road is a perfect example of a movie which I want to love a lot more than I actually do, because for me the ending let me down. It just tried to get a bit too pretentious, and I went into all that in its own review, so I'm not going to rehash that. But I'm sure you can think of movies as well that you've really liked right up until the ending, and it's a shame when that happens. For me, The Corridor did not do that. It did stick the landing, and I think it wrapped up pretty nicely. There are certain things left open to interpretation, and things that are left ambiguous, such as the nature of the phenomena itself, and I think it's all the better for it, because just like with Ridley Scott's Alien, we didn't really need to know where the xenomorphs come from for it to be effective. You learn next to nothing about the creature in the first movie, and yet it managed to be one of the most horrific movie monsters of all time, and still is, despite the fact that we do know more about it, because it wasn't necessary. It was just a great film, and it used its monster in a great way. I would say that The Corridor also does that very well, but without a monster. It just uses the phenomena and the effects of it in a really effective way. Now, next up, to get to the point of the characters, I actually am going to give a higher score to the characters than to the story, because in a movie like this, where you have for sure characters who are kind of stereotypical in their look, there's about 4 or 5 friends all in, I believe there's 5 of them, and there are only about 9 or 10 people in the whole movie anyway. But within the group, you've got the strong silent leader, you've got the more nerdy guy with the glasses, you've got the big guy who's kind of brash. Very stereotypical looking characters. And the actors, for me personally, were not known. I haven't seen them before. Doubtless some of you have. I guess they're probably better known in Canadian cinema, maybe Canadian TV. But they managed to write them in a way that they actually didn't feel cliche. They all do feel like genuine characters. You get kind of small insights into the backstory of each of them, either visually or through things that they say, and some things are more inferred rather than fully told. And it works well. It actually creates genuine tension, because even the characters who I didn't like, I did still care how they factored into the story. That's good storytelling, because you need to care about the characters. This is something which I talk about a lot in my horror movie reviews, because it's something that so many horror movies, and especially the people behind these movies and the writers, they seem to forget. It's easy to say that it's lazy writing, but it's actually worse than that. People just don't realise that in order to have not just a schlocky, campy, quick buck horror movie, but a genuinely brilliant one, you need to write and create and spend time with characters who you actually care about, either in a good or a bad way, for their deaths to mean something. That's why the majority of the Saw films, some of the Final Destination deaths, and a couple of other more schlocky, generic horror films in general, that's why they get it so wrong sometimes, because you just don't care. They don't even feel like characters, they feel like fodder to be stabbed and slashed and cut to pieces and electrocuted and whatever the case may be. In this movie they don't. They do all feel like genuine characters, and because there are so few of them, it raises the stakes once again. When each of them has something happen to them, it means more. So I think that's great. I'm giving it an 8 as far as the characters go. Now, as far as the visuals, I did, of course, already mention that it doesn't have a traditional monster in that sense. It's not that kind of movie. And it's mostly the paranoia through conversation and through kind of intense dialogue. So the visual side of things isn't quite as strong. It's much more about the conversation, about the actors, and about the performances than it is about special effects or makeup and that kind of thing. And that's not bad. It works very well. Even something like the Andromeda Strain, the classic version, which is one of my favourite movies of all time, that movie isn't filled with gore and blood and crazy effects, but the visuals that it does have serve it well, and it's very, very effective. I would say it's actually one of the scariest movies of all time, because you have to think about the movie. It's a thinking man's horror sci-fi movie. And I would say that The Corridor has elements of that as well. Not necessarily to the same standard, but certainly to a good enough standard to get a lot of enjoyment out of it. So for me, I'm going to give the visuals a 6. One of the reasons as well why I'm giving it a 6 and not a 7, which is what I originally considered, is because some of the effects regarding the corridor itself, this phenomena, they're a little bit TV quality. Now, of course, TV is a lot better than it used to be these days, which is why I'm not saying that that's awful. It's just, for me, kind of noticeable. A little bit Stargate-esque in the visual side of things, and there's not really much they could have done about that. Not without, doubling the budget or something, but what they did with what they had to work with is certainly more than good enough, which is why I am still giving it a 6, which is above par. As far as the audio, the soundtrack, the sound design in general, well, this isn't quite like Black Mountain Side, which is very strongly influenced and hinges very well on its audio, the lack of a soundtrack, some great audio effects. Black Mountain Side is an excellent example of good sound design. This one, not so much. I do like the soundtrack, I like the music, and some of it is like actual songs, some of it is a score, and I liked it. It was quite atmospheric, subtle but atmospheric, so again, I'm going to give it a 7. And finally, for the rewatchability and the entertainment factor, and you could argue as well the recommendation factor, would you recommend it to a friend? In my case, would I recommend it to you? Well, yes, I definitely would, and for that, I'm actually going to give it another 8. So that's a pretty decent score. The reason why I'm giving it an 8 is because I think, put simply, it's a good movie. I would not say it's as good as some of the others that I've mentioned and referenced in this video, most notably Black Mountain Side or Isolation, but it is very good, and that is pretty clearly shown by my score. I'm giving it a 3.6 out of 5 as a combination of those 5 scores put together. That doesn't sound like the most amazing score in the world, but for my scoring system, that is actually pretty good, especially for a movie from a few years ago now. It's almost a decade old, that many people haven't even heard of. I don't really hear anyone talking about this movie, and although it has had some reviews, not very many. This is a very, very small movie, barely anyone in it, clearly a low budget, but I would say it does a really good job with the budget that it's given. Great characters, great performances. The visuals are effective, not necessarily going to blow your mind, but they get the job done. Good soundtrack, good score, and it's entertaining. I actually really enjoyed this little movie. So overall, if you do get a chance to watch The Corridor from 2010, sometimes cited as being from 2011, sometimes even 2012, then give it a chance, because if you are a fan of my reviews, if you're a fan of the kind of movies that I talk about, these very undervalued gems in the horror or thriller categories, and especially along the lines of stuff like Black Mountain Side, which as far as I'm concerned is pretty much the ultimate horror hidden gem, then check this one out, because you'll definitely see the similarities. If you like those kind of movies, I think you'll appreciate this one, and even if it doesn't become like one of your top 5s, I think it might actually become one that you'll want to revisit. It certainly is for me, and it's one which I'm very happy to recommend as well. But that's it for this review. Of course, I will see you guys next time, and for now, as always, thanks for watching.